Welcome to New Possibilities. I speak truth to power without fear. So this is a follow-up to my last video about Cornel West and Ta-Nehisi Coates. And the first video primarily focused on Cornel West's motivations. And as I said in that video, I think that Cornel West is a jealous-hearted person. He's a petty person, and he's motivated by jealousy. He hates to see this relatively young brother receive all this attention, all these accolades, all these awards, especially given the fact that this brother did not graduate from some Ivy League college. The brother didn't even graduate from college. He dropped out of Howard University, the same school that I attended. And I think that Cornel West just hates the fact that this brother is on the rise. I think it just boils down to that. So for that video, I didn't even focus on the substantive arguments that Cornel West raised in this article in The Guardian, but today I'm going to do so. And I said, well, let me listen to Ta-Nehisi Coates' latest book before I actually respond to Cornel West in a substantive way. So I've had a chance to listen to that book in its entirety. And as you all know, I have done reviews of Ta-Nehisi Coates' works before. I've read his articles. In fact, I did a review on his article dealing with reparations. And I've also done a review on his other book, The World and Me, which is an excellent book. It's a bestseller, and I encourage you to buy it. So for this video, I'm going to go through a lot of the points that Cornel West raises, and I'm going to provide my substantive response, and then also I'm going to provide additional commentary as we go through this article. So the first point that Cornel West makes is this. He says, Coates and I come from a great tradition of black freedom struggle. He represents the neoliberal wing that sounds militant about white supremacy, but renders black fight back invisible. Now, he doesn't explain how Ta-Nehisi Coates renders the black fight back invisible. And, I think that that's a vague term that he's using here. He's not fully explaining himself, because Ta-Nehisi Coates regularly talks about like the current day struggles that black people are engaged in. He talks about historical struggles, the fight that black people wage historically and presently. So I have no idea what point Cornel West is making when he says that Coates renders the black fight back invisible. Then he goes on to say this. He says, this wing reaps the benefits of the neoliberal establishment that rewards silences on issues such as Wall Street greed or Israeli occupation of Palestinian lands and people. And then he further states that the disagreement between Coates and me is clear. Any analysis of our vision of the world that omits the centrality of Wall Street power, U.S. military policies, and the complex dynamics of class, gender, and sexuality in Black America is too narrow and dangerously misleading. So it is with Ta-Nehisi Coates' worldview. Dangerously misleading. So he's implying that Coates is trying to deceive people. Whether intentionally or unintentionally, he's saying that he's misleading people. And I think that that shows the type of animosity that Cornel West has towards his brother. But let's talk about this. So the first thing that we have to do is define neoliberalism. And according to Wikipedia, neoliberalism refers to primarily the 21st century resurgence of 19th century ideas associated with laissez-faire economic liberalism. Such ideas include economic liberalization of policies such as privatization, austerity, deregulation, free trade, and reductions in government spending in order to increase the role of the private sector in the economy and society. And it talks about how this is a paradigm shift away from policies or consensus that last from 1945 to 1980. Now, let's break this down. I've read several of Ta-Nehisi Coates' articles, and I've, again, listened to the book We Were 8 Years in Power. Nowhere in there, nowhere in his works is he talking about economic liberalization. Nowhere is he talking about privatization of schools or austerity or deregulation of Wall Street or free trade. That is not something that Ta-Nehisi Coates talks about in his writing. He doesn't advocate less government spending. He doesn't talk about increasing the role of the private sector in the economy or in society. So for that reason, Coates is not a so-called neoliberal. I think that that term is just used to tarnish people and try to discredit them, to make it seem as if somehow Cornel West is more authentically tied to the Black liberation struggle than Ta-Nehisi Coates. Coates, his father was a Black Panther. He's definitely tied to our struggle. I mean, he writes about race and all that stuff, and we'll get into that. His focus is on race and racism, white supremacy. He is not talking about neoliberal policies. I can't recall anywhere in his writings where he is advocating any of these so-called neoliberal policies. Now, I think that what Cornel West is trying to get at is the fact that Coates supports Obama. He has praised Obama in his book, We Were 8 Years in Power. But the thing that Cornel West fails to realize that Coates also criticizes Obama. He criticizes Obama in different ways, and we're going to get into it. Like one thing that Cornel West mentioned was this whole military issue. He talked about how Coates doesn't address U.S. military policy, and that's not true. I mean, in this book, We Were 8 Years in Power, he mentions Obama's drone policy. He mentions Obama using drones to assassinate U.S. citizens. He mentions that. So he does, in fact, address U.S. military policy. He's not endorsing Obama's U.S. military policy. He criticized Obama for not directly focusing on race and just implementing policies designed to address a wide range of people, policies that are not race specific, but policies that have been beneficial to Black people. So the bottom line is this. He praises Obama's ability as a politician to get things done in terms of getting laws passed and being elected twice as an African American. He praises him for that. He praises him as a role model, but he also criticizes Obama's respectability politics and all that kind of stuff. So the bottom line is this. I think that this label of neoliberalism doesn't neatly fit with Ta-Nehisi Coates, and I think that Cornel West's assertion is weak at best because, again, for the reasons I previously stated, Coates is not a quote-unquote neoliberal. So let's continue to go through this. And then also, this whole point about silence on Wall Street greed, I think that that is a very weak point because throughout Coates' work, he talks about the mortgage foreclosure crisis. He talks about redlining. He talks about discrimination used by these financial institutions, these banks. And we know that these banks are at the heart of what Wall Street is all about. We know that they are key players in Wall Street. And he criticizes banks and their racist policies towards African Americans, whether we're talking about in the past with redlining and restrictive covenants and all that stuff, or whether we're talking about the present with the mortgage foreclosure crisis and the breakdown of the economy. He talked about, if I'm not mistaken, he mentioned the fact that none of those Wall Street bankers were convicted by the Justice Department. So I just think that it's an exaggeration, what Cornel West is putting out here. Also, he says that any vision that omits the complex dynamics of class and gender and sexuality is too narrow. So Coates does address the issue of class in his books and his articles and all that kind of stuff. He addresses the reality of the class struggle. Like he's not focused on some vision as some socialist or Marxist or anything like that. He deals with the reality of class in America. He deals with the reality that many of these white people who are workers and who are poor, they look at themselves as white first. And they are just as racist as the white elite that has influence and power in this country. He deals with that reality. He doesn't live in this fantasy world that a lot of these leftists live in, where they imagine that someday all these white workers are going to get together with black workers. He sees the reality of these people. He sees the fact that many of these workers and stuff like that, they were active in the KKK and other hate groups, and they're active in them today. You'll see that most of these right-wing racist groups are filled with these so-called working class people that we're supposed to be trying to unite with. He confronts that reality. And everybody doesn't have to be a democratic socialist or a Marxist or anything like that to be passionate and to be involved in the struggle of our people. And he deals with gender issues as well. I mean, in his works, he deals with, he discusses gender. He deals with that when he talks about his wife and, the issues that women deal with. He addresses that. And he also talks about the issue of homophobia and all that kind of stuff. So, again, what you have here is an exaggeration in Cornel West's article. And then he goes on to say this. This may be a long video, so y'all gonna have to bear with me. I just feel the need to respond to this directly after knowing about Coates' work. So he says this: Coates rightly highlights the vicious legacy of white supremacy, past and present. And then he goes on to say he sees it everywhere and reminds us of its plundering effects. Unfortunately, he hardly keeps track of our fight back and never connects this ugly legacy to the predatory capitalist practices, imperial policies of war, occupation, detention, and assassination, or the black elite's refusal to confront poverty, patriarchy, and transphobia. Now, let's unpack this. He says he rarely keeps track of our fight back. Again, I have no idea what he's talking about there, because Coates regularly talks about the different movements in the black community, both past and present, that have fought against racism. And then he said he never connects it to the ugly legacy of predatory capitalist practices. And that's not true. Again, he talked about how banks redlined black communities. He talked about how he also talked about the mortgage foreclosure crisis, and those are predatory capitalist practices. He's talked about the wars in Iraq and all that kind of stuff. He's briefly talked about those. And then he talks about the black elite's refusal to confront poverty. That's what Cornel West is asserting. And patriarchy, again, Coates addresses patriarchy. That's something that he talks about. He had an article that he mentions in his book, We Were 8 Years in Power. And in that article, he talks about the perils of patriarchy. He talks about the Moynihan Report and this promotion of patriarchy as a way to address the problems in the black family, and he raises his concerns about that. So again, Cornel West misses the mark with this comment. And then this whole thing about the black elite's refusal to confront poverty, and that's BS, man. Because you have a lot of black elected officials in the BBC, the Congressional Black Caucus, CBC, who regularly have tried to pass laws and stuff to address the problem of poverty in black communities. You have people like Bobby Scott that have raised legislation to address issues of poverty in black communities, and many others. So again, I think it's an exaggeration to say that the black elite is refusing to confront poverty. And you saw that same argument during Obama's time in the White House. That was some red herring that Cornel West and and Tavis Smiley would regularly raise, say Obama's doing nothing to address poverty, and they even had their little poverty tour and this and that. When the fact of the matter is, because of Obama's policies, unemployment in the black community went down substantially, and that's something that Cornel West refuses to acknowledge. And then, again, with respect to these imperial policies, Coates addresses assassinations, he addresses drones and all that stuff in his book, We Were 8 Years in Power. So again, you have an exaggeration here. And then he goes on to say this. He says, Coates fetishizes white supremacy. He makes it almighty, magical, and unremovable. And then he goes on to talk about how it generates crocodile tears of neoliberals who have no intention of sharing power or giving up privilege. Now, that's a valid point about neoliberals who don't want to give up privilege and all that stuff. But let's talk about this issue of white supremacy. And I think that what happens is you have these people who are either socialists or Marxists or whatever who want to de-emphasize race and they want to focus solely on class. When the fact of the matter is, yes, slavery and stuff like that came out of economic need or economic desire and greed and capitalism and all that stuff. There's a great book written by Eric Williams entitled Slavery and Capitalism or something to that effect. And it outlines that. It outlines how Europeans gained financially as a result of the slave trade. And it talks about how that was the primary motivation behind slavery. The financial benefits. I mean, all kinds of institutions benefited from slavery, whether we're talking about banks, insurance, government itself, all kinds of financial institutions benefited. Actual families benefited from it. So I understand the need for class analysis, but what happened was this. In order for slavery to exist, in order for discrimination to exist, they had to create this myth of white supremacy. And when they created this myth of white supremacy, that myth began to take on a life of its own. Coates talks about how basically the elite made these poor whites identify with the elite by giving them a status of being above black people who were of the same class, for instance, by telling them that they were superior because they were white. And essentially, white supremacy has a life of its own. You can have a situation where you eliminate these class issues, for instance. But racism will continue to thrive because, again, it has a life of its own. All we have to do is look at the situation in Cuba. You have a socialist government over there, but racism still is alive and well in places like Cuba. When you look at the top tier leadership in Cuba, you see that it's primarily white people. And, I'll post a link in the cards to, I mean, not in the cards, but in the description box to articles about racism in Cuba to make this clear. I think that it is ridiculous to de-emphasize race. Race is a central issue to our condition as a people. And I'm glad that you have people like Coates focusing on this issue. And by focusing on white supremacy and racism in this country, that is not fetishizing it. It's realizing its very real impact on our lives. And Coates, his works are brilliant. He explains the role of racism in history and in present day life. So let's go through this a little bit further. Yeah, and then he talks about this. He talks about how his perception that white people note that his perception of white people is tribal and his conception of freedom is neoliberal, which again is ridiculous for the reasons I previously stated. Racial groups are homogeneous and freedom is individualistic in his world. Classes don't exist and empires are non-existent. I mean, again, this is not true. I mean, he talks about class. He talks about the existence of class in his articles, but he just points out how class, by focusing on class, like what people, he talks about how these politicians and how these leftists tried to build a broad coalition by talking in non-racial terms, by talking in terms of class and all that kind of stuff, but they ignore the racial dynamics. They ignore the need for race-specific remedies to racial problems. And by doing so, the black community gets the short end of the stick. And often, these white workers, many of them are not going to unite with the cause of working people, period. You will find that the most racist people, again, are these white workers and poor whites. Waiting on them to develop some kind of class consciousness is like waiting on some kind of mythical character to come save you. And, that's something that he realizes. And he realizes that, yes, there is, you know, a tribal type of mentality among groups in this country. Groups function as groups. They don't function as like some overall class focused on some class struggle for the most part. I mean, you do have coalitions, and I support coalitions with people of goodwill, but we have to deal with the reality, and that's what he deals with. He deals with the reality of race, and that's something that even the Cornel West is afraid to actually deal with in depth. Instead they would rather focus on some general class struggle, focus on this and focus on that to try to build some kind of broad consensus. So let's go on into this article. Okay, and this is the point I want to focus on next. So he says, unfortunately, Coates' allegiance to Obama has produced an impoverished understanding of black history. He reveals this when he writes, Ossie Davis famously eulogized Malcolm X as our living black manhood and our own black shining prince. Only one man today could bear those twin honorifics, Barack Obama. So he's quoting um, Coates in his book, We Were 8 Years in Power. And then he goes on to say this gross misunderstanding of who Malcolm X was, the greatest prophetic voice against the American empire, and who Barack Obama is, the first black head of the American empire, speaks volumes about Coates' neoliberal view of the world. All right, so let's go into this. And again, that's what I was trying to say, that he's trying to basically say he's a neoliberal because he supports Obama in some ways. So I think that there's some validity to this point about this comparison between Barack Obama and Malcolm X. I think that that is an exaggeration. I don't think that Obama represents our living black manhood, because a man is somebody that's willing to speak up and speak out, and that's not something that Obama naturally did. Obama was reluctant to talk about race throughout most of his campaign, and actually throughout his 8 years in the White House. There were occasions where he dealt with race, where he had to speak about race, and based on a lot of the negative reactions from a lot of white people and a lot of Republicans and all that kind of stuff, he stopped talking about some issues, after, like, for instance, the thing with Henry Louis Gates, and when he talked about how the cop behaved stupidly, and when he said that if he had a son, he would look like Trayvon Martin and all that kind of stuff. He received a lot of attacks for those statements. And because of that, I think that he went further into not talking about race as much as he should. And he focused more on passing policies that would be beneficial to African Americans along with other Americans. So a lot of his policies weren't race specific, but he was pragmatic in the sense that he implemented policies that actually benefited black communities. But he was less reluctant to speak out boldly and courageously. And to a degree, that's understandable given the fact that he's a politician who is running for a national office. He would not have been elected if he was speaking out like a Farrakhan um, or a Malcolm X or somebody like that, or even somebody like a Jesse Jackson or Al Sharpton. He would not have been elected. He would not have been able to get any laws passed if he had that kind of posture. So it's understandable why he did not have that kind of posture. But at the same time, someone who's tiptoeing around issues, avoiding openly discussing race and stuff like that, cannot be defined as our living black manhood. So on that point, I understand what Cornel West is saying, and I think that it is a poor comparison to try to say, well, to put these two men on the same level. And in many ways, Obama is a great man, despite some of the disagreements that I have with some of his policies. He is a great man just for his achievements. And in that sense, I could see how somebody could say that he's a shining black prince. I can understand how somebody could make that comparison because, for one, he's the first African American president, so that is something that is like a prince-like status. I mean, people looked at him as an example, him and his family in the White House holding power and behaving in a dignified way. These people they're educated, they're dignified and professional. There were no personal controversies while he was in the White House, no issues or scandals and all that kind of stuff. So in a lot of ways, he was a shining black prince. He is a shining black prince. He is something that people can look up to despite like policy disagreements. You can talk about various policy issues that you disagree with him on, and rightfully so. Uh, you could talk about how the Affordable Care Act didn't go far enough. We need um, single payer and all that kind of stuff. We can all talk about that, and I support that. We can talk about his support of drone attacks and, this so-called war on terror and all that kind of stuff. We can talk about a lot of policy issues. But if you just look at him as an example in terms of being educated, being a father, being a leader who was able to lead effectively, whether you disagree or agree with his policies, one could compare him to a black shining prince. So that aspect I agree with, But this point about him being the head of the American empire and Malcolm X being a voice against the empire, that's a valid point. And I won't go into this drone thing. We talked about that before. So yeah, that's a summary of some of my issues with this. That's my summary of substantive response to the things that Cornel West said in this article. So tell me what you all think. Please rate, comment, and subscribe. Peace. So after listening to my video, I noticed that there were a couple of things that I failed to talk about, and I want to talk about those now. The first one is this issue of Palestine, the occupation of Palestinian lands and people. One of the points that Cornel West raised in this article was this. He basically said that people like Ta-Nehisi Coates are being rewarded for being silent on the Palestinian issue. And I think that that's a valid point because as far as I can tell, Ta-Nehisi Coates does not raise that issue for the most part in his writings. I think he briefly mentioned it in passing in his article on reparations, but he doesn't focus on it. And I can understand why he doesn't focus on it. I mean, his focus is race and racism in America, so I get it to a degree, but I think that people who are about liberation of all people should be in support of the Palestinian struggle. And I do believe that if this brother were to speak out on that issue, that he would not receive the same kind of praise and attention that he has received now. So I think that that is a valid point. For instance, when people speak out on this issue of Palestine, they have been labeled as being anti-Semitic. And when you're labeled as anti-Semitic, the media will persecute you, or the media will try to ignore you and suppress your voice. So I think that that is a very valid point. You know, people like Farrakhan and others have been labeled as anti-Semitic. And one thing that stands out in Coates' writing is that he uses that same kind of terminology when he describes Farrakhan. He used that same type of terminology when he described even Malcolm X. He described early Malcolm X as being a black supremacist, and technically I can see how someone could try to make that argument, but I think that that types of language parrots the language of mainstream media, and I think that that makes Coates more palatable to these mainstream outlets and stuff like that. So essentially I think that West makes a valid point on this Palestinian issue. So that was the first issue that I neglected to talk about that I wanted to talk about here. And also I want to talk about this issue of reparations. Now, I briefly mentioned it during my first video, and it's a point that was brought to my attention when I saw Jelani Cobb's tweets to Cornel West. And I think it's a valid point. I mean, basically, the brother Jelani Cobb said what neoliberal supports reparations, and that's something that Coates supports. He supports reparations. That is not a neoliberal position. There aren't many neoliberals demanding reparations from the United States government and from financial institutions. So that is a valid point that should be raised and highlighted, and it completely undermines Cornel West's argument that Coates is a neoliberal. So that was the second point that I wanted to raise before I close out. And then the third point that I'm going to raise in conclusion is this whole issue of atheism. And this is what West had to say about Coates, because Coates constantly talks about how he's an atheist in his writings. And frankly, that's one thing that I find unsettling, to say the least. I mean, I understand that everybody's entitled to their beliefs and their, their belief or disbelief and all that kind of stuff. But as somebody that's always believed in God, I find atheism like unsettling. And that's just me being honest. But here's what West says. He says that Coates tries to justify his defiance by an appeal to black atheism, to a belief in dreams and moral appeal. And then he goes on to say he not only has no expectations of white people at all, but for him, if freedom means anything at all, it is this defiance. And and I get that point. Like, basically in his book, We Were 8 Years in Power, he talks about how nobody's gonna rescue us. Like, one of the reasons why he's an atheist is because he basically says that nobody is going to rescue. And then he uses the example of like how he was attacked by some bullies and nobody rescued him. He talks about like all the stuff that black people have been through and nobody has been there to rescue people. And he talked about like the cruel nature of this world and how there is no one coming to save you. And basically he's saying that a just God would not allow these things to happen. He doesn't say that directly, but that's what he implies. And for that reason, like, he embraces this black atheism and stuff like that. But I see the flip side of it. I see the flip side of the situation. And again, I just find atheism to be unsettling. Anytime I hear that people don't believe in God, something about it disturbs me. And I mean, I know that people are entitled to their beliefs and everything. But again, I'm just being real and stuff. But I see the flip side of the situation. I mean, if you look at where we were when we got to this country, slaves with no rights, slaves that could be beaten and killed and lynched and castrated, and you look at where we are today, to me, That's evidence that there is, in fact, a God. You know, where we have come from to where we are today. That proves that there is some divine intervention in our lives. Our ancestors, you know, their faith in God kept them going, man. It kept them going in those slave fields when they were being beaten. It kept them going when they were fighting for civil and human rights. It kept them going. Like, for instance, it kept Nat Turner going when he decided to wage war against his enemies. It kept us going when we were facing the fire hoses and the police dogs and the batons and the lynchings and all that kind of stuff. And it keeps us going, man. And we have seen miracles in our lives as a collective group of people when we see how far we have come as a people. To me, that history bears witness to the existence of a God. It gives me reason to believe. And, you know, I'm not saying that it's like definitive proof, but it is reason to believe in a higher power, a higher order. And I could have an endless debate about that, but I had to touch on that issue before I close. So again, tell me what you all think. Please rate, comment, and subscribe. Peace.